Slick and Shiny tongue-in-cheek productions now takes you on another trip to one of the local communities in Westmoreland County, PA. And to help you have something to look at while I'm talking to you, I'm going to put this on. I'm going to put this on slideshow. There, I think we're going. What I have to say is that there are really 3 occupation periods here at New Florence. One was prehistoric. It involved the Monongahela culture of Native Americans. The other 2 were during the historic period. One was a place called Centerville, which related to the time of the canal, which was part of the old Pennsylvania Public Works, a project of transportation going from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. And then the railroad came through, and that put the canal place called Centerville in eclipse, and that's what started New Florence beginning. Without the railroad, New Florence would never have happened. What I should say is that at New Florence, there are 2 sites on the National Register. The National Register is usually called the National Register of Historic Sites, but in this case, one of the sites is prehistoric and one is historic. So there are a number of sites on the National Register that are prehistoric, but most of them are historic. New Florence derived its name from immigrants from Italy, recalling the town or the city of Florence. And they named New Florence from Old Florence in Italy. The borough of New Florence was incorporated in 1869. And the very next year there was a census taken, and there were all of 330 people living in New Florence then. And I just want to mention that among them were a physician and a photographer, to note the fact that there were professional types there then. 100 years later, in 1970, there were 927 people living in New Florence. And among the places that New Florence sheltered or had were 2 newspapers, a bank, a movie, a tannery, a foundry, a lumber mill, feed mill, etc., etc. And finally, they had a brickyard there. Some of the houses at New Florence were made with bricks that were made just to the west of there. Now, when you think of the numbers involved, number of people living there, you might think that it was pretty small. But what to think of is places like New Florence became a focus for farmers living in the neighborhood. And there were quite a few of them. And so the farmers, even though they lived on their farms, they came into New Florence to, take advantage of what they might get there, whether they needed to see a blacksmith, a justice of the peace, or a doctor, or whatever. And finally, before I start to show the other pictures, I want to mention that without the railroad, there would not have been New Florence. It never would have existed. Now, what I want to do is to shut this down and take a look at our pictures one by one and talk about them. This is a very old map of Westmoreland County. And to orient you, I can show you here. Right here is Greensburg. And way out here in the northeast part of the county is St. Clair Township. And right here is New Florence that we're going to be seeing. That's an enlargement. The town was just laid out in this grid structure just 5 years before this map was made. This is the railroad coming through, the Pennsylvania Railroad, which came through in 1852. This up here is the canal, which came through in the 1830s. Now here is a map from about 20 years later, the 1870s, 1876. This is New Florence, which we will come in on a bit closer. Here is the town itself. Over here, there was a prehistoric site, a Monongahela village, Native American types. Way over here was Laurel Hill Furnace, one of the old iron furnaces of the county. And that is what is the historic site. That's the iron furnace. Around 1845, they started to build that. This is New Florence. This is just showing you. Here is that furnace we were just looking at right here, and I'll come in a little closer. Here is the Laurel Hill Furnace right here. And what you can notice is there was habitation starting to form around the furnace itself because they needed quite a few people to make them work. You know, the guys who ran the place did the work. Here was a church, and there was a grist mill, cemetery, you know, the little things that keep people going. But it was really just to the east of New Florence. It didn't have a name. It related to it. It was called New Florence also. Now, there are two guys sitting back here by their shed, and this stuff here is charcoal. These were the guys who made the charcoal that burnt the iron ore, heated it, to make the iron that this furnace produced. Now we go from the east of New Florence, which is over on the right side, to the left side of New Florence. This is just a part of New Florence. And this is where there was a Monongahela village, a prehistoric site. Now this is about an acre that's been excavated, studied by archaeologists. This just shows an area studied by ground penetrating radar. These are test pits 1, 3, 4, and 5. And this is, I believe, 2 and 6. And they're not large. They're maybe a meter by a meter. This is what the archaeologists come up with when they did archaeological testing. This would be the site of the Monongahela village. This was a road, contemporary road, went through it. This shows a Monongahela village, palisade around the side, and these round things, here's an enlargement of them. This is the kind of huts they lived in. And this site would have continued. This is just about a half of it. Now these are the kind of projectile points they made. These are actual arrowheads, because for a lot of the prehistoric period, the Native Americans made things that people call arrowheads, but they weren't. They were projectiles for spears or atlatls. But in the late woodland period, which is what we're dealing with here, they made actual arrowheads. These are Madison-style points. Now we get a look at a topo map. This is Laurel Ridge. This is Chestnut Ridge. And right in here is New Florence, which we're taking a look at, and we're going to get an enlargement of that. This is the town of New Florence with the the Conemaugh River going by. Across the river was Centerville. That was created when the canal went through. But this topo map is from 1920, and by that time, no evidence of the old canal existed. But the railroad, the main line of the old PRR, is still there. And the railroad is what was responsible for New Florence developing, as the canal was responsible for Centerville developing. And when the railroad came through, that struck the death knell for Centerville, which no longer exists. And it was also called Huff at one time. That's the only picture I have from Centerville, Clausen's store. This is building the bridge from New Florence over to Centerville. And that's a newer version of it. This one was wiped out by the flood in 1977. We see it again. Now we look at it in a contemporary view from up in the air, from Google Earth. This is New Florence down here. I'm going to enlarge that a bit. Here we see New Florence on the south side of the river. This is the river. And where Centerville used to be, it doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. It was wiped out by a power plant. This is the Conemaugh generating station. And there's the railroad coming through. Like I said, without the railroad, New Florence would never have happened. Features associated with the railroad and the crossing, the railroad station, and that's where it was in town. And the underpass replaced the crossing. This was the railroad bridge. That was the location of the railroad bridge. And at this point, I'm going to push a button and shut down and say so long. Thanks for coming along on our trip.